"Dad, you shouldn't be here," my son said, his voice sharp, carrying across the classroom filled with chatter and the faint smell of crayons. I straightened my coat, my hand brushing the polish with a teacher's desk. Silence was my shield, my eyes catching the principal's flicker of recognition. He thought he'd humiliated me, but patience, as always, was my quiet weapon. Before I tell you how it all turned around, like and subscribe. Tell me which state you're listening from. I want to see how far these stories travel. The school hallways smelled faintly of dry erase markers and waxed linoleum, mingling with the nervous scent of children and parents on a busy Friday morning. I had come to Jefferson Elementary for Henry's class presentation, nothing more than a grandfatherly gesture, or so I thought. But as I stepped into the room, I realized my son, Daniel, had other plans. "Dad," he said, loud enough for the teachers to hear, "I don't know why you're here. You're not really family to any of us anymore." The word struck like a hammer to glass. Heads turned, parents stiffened, children froze mid-laugh, and even the teachers exchanged awkward glances. Daniel's voice carried confidence, as if he had rehearsed a moment for weeks. He leaned against the teacher's desk, arms crossed, chest puffed out, and delivered a full line with a cruel precision. "You weren't part of raising him," Daniel continued, gesturing toward Henry. "We've done everything ourselves. You're just a visitor. I've told everyone. You're not even supposed to attend these events. So maybe you should leave." A teacher, attempting diplomacy, murmured, "Daniel, that's a little harsh." "No," he interrupted, cutting her off with a sharp hand gesture. "It's the truth. Dad, I don't want people confusing you with family. I've made that very clear to the principal and the staff." I stood there quietly, feeling the weight of every eye on me. My hand brushed against the edge of a chair, fingering the polished wood for control. I smelled the faint scent of Henry's glue and colored paper, innocence hanging in the air like a fragile shield. My son was not only denying me publicly, he was rewriting the story of our family in front of witnesses, stripping away any respect I had earned over decades. Daniel's cruelty went beyond words. He pulled out a tablet and, with an exaggerated flourish, showed a digital slideshow he had made for the parents. The first few images were Henry's artwork, then suddenly appeared photos of me at the courthouse years ago, in my judge's robes. Faces blurred, titles removed, accompanied by captions like, "Not part of our family life." The teachers exchanged uneasy glances. A few whispered behind cupped hands, uncertain whether to intervene. "See," Daniel said, pointing at the images. "He's never been involved. He doesn't pay attention. He doesn't contribute. Look at him now, just standing there, pretending to belong." I felt a flicker of anger, but I kept my expression still. My eyes tracked the principal, who froze mid-step, her hand hovering over her clipboard. Recognition flashed briefly across her face. Then she masked it with a polite cough. My silence was deliberate, allowing my son to believe he controlled the room, unaware that observation itself was power. Daniel's next move was calculated. He knelt down at Henry's level and whispered something, loud enough for the teachers nearby to overhear. "See, Henry? Grandpa doesn't really care about you. He's just pretending." Henry's small hands gripped his papier-mâché volcano, uncertain. I caught the boy's eyes, full of confusion and worry. I simply smiled faintly and nodded, letting the gesture be enough reassurance for him. The parents, initially polite and smiling, began shifting uncomfortably. Murmurs rose. "Is he serious? That doesn't seem right." Some turned their heads to Principal, whose lips pressed in a thin line. Daniel, sensing his victory, straightened, chest swelling with pride. His plan was perfect. Public humiliation, erasure of authority, and social isolation, all wrapped into a single performance. When the bell rang to signal the next class, he didn't stop. "Dad, maybe you should just leave. No one wants to see you here. This isn't your place." I nodded slowly, deliberately turning my back. I walked to the doorway, each step measured, letting the sound of my polished shoes on linoleum echo slightly, subtle but commanding. I paused at the doorframe and looked back once. Daniel's triumphant smirk faltered as he noticed my composure. The teacher's whispers carried to him, their eyes hinting that perhaps there was more to me than he realized. Outside the classroom, I inhaled the crisp autumn air, smelling damp leaves and gasoline from the school buses idling nearby. My son's betrayal was cruel, a calculated strike against every ounce of dignity I had executed in front of witnesses. And yet, even as the sting of humiliation burned, I felt no need to respond in anger. Patience, as always, was my weapon, and the full weight of my hidden life was already beginning to ripple beneath the surface. Even Daniel, in his moment of triumph, couldn't fully mask a flicker of unease crossing his features. Something in the teacher's cautious glances, the principal's subtle nods, suggested that the game he thought he had won might not end the way he imagined. The humiliation lingered longer than Daniel expected. That evening, he couldn't shake the memory of the subtle glances from the teachers, the brief pause of the principal, or the calmness in my eyes as I left the classroom. Something about the way I had held myself, silent, measured, unshaken, kept gnawing at him. By the weekend, he began asking questions, innocent enough to mask suspicion. At the local diner, he asked the waitress casually, "Do you know much about my dad? He used to come here a lot, right?" The woman paused mid-sip of her coffee, eyebrows lifting, and muttered, "He's always quiet, but you feel there's something. Like he's seen a lot, done a lot." Daniel's curiosity became an obsession. He pulled out old yearbooks, searching for traces of my past, flipping pages with shaking hands. Photos of me as a young man, stiff and commanding in suits, accompanied by captions hinting at leadership, started to make him uneasy. He called old acquaintances under the guise of friendly catch-ups, but the questions were pointed. Did he ever hold office? Did he ever work in law? Banking? Something official? Answers came slowly, cautiously, sometimes evasive, but always hinting at something significant. Even casual neighbors whispered differently now. A retired teacher mentioned in passing. He always carried himself like a man who could make the law bend, or at least make people follow it without question. Daniel's chest tightened with each subtle clue he unearthed. The humiliation he had inflicted began to feel unstable, a tower on sand. At night, he lay awake, replaying the school scene, scanning my face in his mind. That calm, measured silence, it wasn't weakness. It was deliberate, and for the first time, he feared there might be consequences far beyond public embarrassment. The more he probed, the more the gaps in his knowledge of me widened. He started noticing small things. The careful handwriting on my notes, the way I read legal briefs at the coffee shop, the faint scent of old leather and ink. By the time Monday rolled around, Daniel's bravado had dulled. He approached the principal again, this time more cautiously, asking questions about my background. Her measured responses, careful and respectful, planted seeds of doubt. He realized he had underestimated the man he had tried to humiliate. I had watched Daniel's performance that Friday morning, every cruel word, every pointed gesture, and the deliberate effort to humiliate me, and I had felt nothing but a quiet resolve. For decades, I had learned that dignity was preserved not through argument, but through patience. The truth, I knew, would eventually speak for itself. I was born in a small town not far from here, where everyone knew your family history, your failures, and your secrets. My father was a stern man, a veteran of a war I never knew enough to question, and he instilled in me a discipline I carried into adulthood. I had always been fascinated by justice, by the careful balance of right and wrong, and so I pursued law. By the age of 25, I was clerking in the county courthouse, learning the subtle art of persuasion and the weight of silence. Years passed. I rose quietly but firmly, never seeking the limelight. I became a district judge, a position of influence and authority that demanded discretion and integrity. My work involved lives, legacies, and decisions that shaped families, sometimes for generations. I learned early that power, wielded subtly, could correct injustices without spectacle. And I learned to observe people, to see through false bravado and hidden motives, skills that now allowed me to see Daniel for what he had become. When Henry was born, I retreated even further from public recognition. I wanted him to grow in love, not under the shadow of my title. I wanted my family to thrive without feeling my influence pressing down, guiding or controlling. That was why I kept my identity secret. My role in law, my connections, even my modest fortune, I preserved it quietly behind closed doors until the time was right. Daniel, in his arrogance, had assumed that absence equaled weakness. He had no idea that my quiet retreat had been a deliberate choice, not a concession. While he floundered through failed ventures and impulsive decisions, I had ensured that every opportunity he thought he had earned would one day come under careful review. My legacy for him had been prepared not in secrecy to punish, but as a test of character, though the cruelty he displayed on Friday showed he had failed before even attempting. I remembered sitting in my chambers long ago, surrounded by leather-bound books and the faint smell of ink and polished wood, drafting quiet arrangements that would preserve my estate and influence. The legal and financial measures were precise, meticulous, and utterly lawful, ensuring that those who acted with integrity would be rewarded, and those who acted with selfishness or cruelty would meet consequences in their own time. Yet it was not wealth that defined me, it was restraint. I had seen far too many lives undone by arrogance and short-sightedness. Daniel's desire to humiliate me in front of his peers and his child had only confirmed that restraint, coupled with observation, would be the most powerful tool I possessed. I had learned to trust the slow movement of justice, the weight of procedure, and the eventual recognition of those with knowledge and discernment. And recognition came in small doses, like the principal's subtle pause that morning. A quiet acknowledgement of who I truly was, hinted at in glances, whispered words, and casual conversations. I knew Daniel had begun to notice, to suspect that his father was not the man he thought he could dismiss so easily. Henry, too, remained a silent witness to my restraint. I carried the boy's drawings in my coat pocket as reminders that innocence still mattered, that true legacy was not in titles or money alone, but in patience, in wisdom, and in the quiet shaping of life through example rather than spectacle. I had prepared gifts for Daniel, legally and financially, but they were contingent on integrity, on humility, and on respect for truth, qualities I no longer saw. The betrayal that had unfolded that Friday was not merely a personal insult. It was a breach of the moral fabric I had sought to instill in my family. And yet I remained calm, knowing the framework I had set in place would now unfold with precision. What came next was a careful, lawful recalibration. The accounts, the assets, the influence, all could be redirected, restored, or revoked in accordance with the principles I had lived by, and Daniel, oblivious to the depth of my hidden life, was already beginning to glimpse the consequences of underestimating me. The morning was quiet, the kind of stillness that seemed to press softly against the windows of my home in Willow Creek. The autumn sun slanted through the blinds, casting long lines across the polished oak desk where I had organized the documents that would alter the course of our family's legacy. Coffee steamed gently in my cup, its aroma a small comfort in a morning heavy with purpose. I began with the financial accounts. The bank manager, accustomed to my presence but never my full intent, raised an eyebrow as I requested the revocation of Daniel's access. "Are you certain?" he asked, glancing at the neatly typed list I had provided. I nodded, fingers tapping lightly on the tabletop, my voice calm but unwavering. "Yes, all accounts under his name or joint with him are to be frozen or transferred according to the estate plan. Please ensure every document is notarized and every record complete." Next came the social dimension. I called a local country club, where Daniel had assumed a certain ease and influence. His membership, once extended through my name, was quietly canceled. Invitations to committees and boards were rescinded, with polite, factual explanations citing policy and eligibility. I left no room for argument. Everything was procedural, factual, and deliberate. The quiet authority of preparation made each act unassailable, a current flowing beneath the surface, unseen but unstoppable. The final measure was personal, emotional in its subtlety. I wrote letters to friends, neighbors, and community members, careful to frame the communications in terms of fairness, integrity, and the principles I had lived by. No anger, no recrimination, only a factual account of decisions and the reasons behind them. I handed a copy of one letter to the principal at Henry's school, another to the family attorney, and kept one for my own records. Each recipient received the same calm, unshakable clarity. The privileges once extended to Daniel were no longer appropriate. Throughout it all, Daniel remained unaware. I observed from a distance, noting how carefully I had orchestrated every step to avoid spectacle. This was not revenge in traditional sense. It was justice carried out in the quietest, most methodical manner possible. Like ink drying on a contract, each action was permanent, irreversible, and devoid of theatrics. By mid-morning, the tide had fully receded. Daniel's access, influence, and control over any portion of our shared life had been curtailed. It was subtle yet complete, like a door gently closing behind him, leaving only the echo of what had once been. I paused, looking out over the small garden behind the house. Leaves fluttered down, drifting into the flower beds in slow, deliberate arcs. The same patience that guided my life now guided this act of justice. I felt no triumph, no gloating, only the calm satisfaction of a task completed with precision and foresight. I made one final call to a trusted family attorney. Ensure every asset is properly reallocated. I instructed all decisions in line with the estate plan. Nothing to contest, nothing left ambiguous. The attorney's acknowledgement was brief but firm. Everything was in motion, moving quietly but with the full weight of law and reason behind it. Even Daniel's pride, once so confident, would crumble under the inevitability of these changes. It was not force or anger that ensured compliance. It was preparation, patience, and the quiet weight of authority. By the time he realized the depth of what had been taken from him, the framework would be complete and there would be no recourse. As the afternoon sun angled lower, casting long shadows across the desk, I leaned back and allowed myself a small sigh. The procedures were complete. The letters, the calls, the notarizations, all done. The world had been realigned with integrity, and Daniel's misjudgment of his father's character was now laid bare, ready to unfold in its own time. Monday morning arrived with a crisp wind that rattled the school windows and carried the scent of wet leaves from the playground. Daniel had expected to wake to a routine day, confident that his bravado from Friday would hold, that I would be nothing more than the absent father in his carefully curated narrative. But reality struck differently. He arrived at the bank first, planning a casual review of the accounts he had assumed were still his. The teller, familiar with him but professionally reserved, looked up as he approached. "Mr. Daniel Thompson, I'm afraid there's been a change. You no longer have access to these accounts." "What do you mean?" he demanded, eyes narrowing, voice rising. "I'm a joint account holder. This isn't legal." "I'm afraid it is," the teller replied, sliding a neatly stamped letter across the counter. The letter, signed, notarized, and dated, clearly outlined the revocations. Financial privileges reassigned, access removed, and directives aligned with the estate plan. Daniel's pulse raced, disbelief flooding his senses. He reread the letter, shaking, his carefully rehearsed confidence dissolving into panic. By mid-morning, the social consequences became evident. Invitations to committees, local clubs, and even casual gatherings vanished. At the country club, the receptionist's polite but firm words echoed in his ears. "Your membership has been rescinded, effective immediately." Faces that had once nodded, smiled, or waved now looked through him, distant and measured. Murmurs rippled through neighbors who had witnessed his Friday performance at the school, and Daniel's social isolation deepened with each passing hour. Even at Jefferson Elementary, subtle changes in attitude cut sharpest. Teachers and staff who had once deferred to him now treated his questions with professional distance. The principal, who had hesitated the previous Friday, now exchanged only brief, courteous glances. Students waved past him in confusion, sensing the tension in their parents' hushed remarks. Everywhere he turned, the social landscape he had once assumed control had shifted. Daniel's emotions tumbled in succession: disbelief, anger, and finally quiet panic. He called friends, allies, anyone who might intercede, but the responses were measured, factual, and neutral. There was no outrage, no sympathy extended. Everyone, it seemed, understood that this was not cruelty or whim, but consequence, and it had been executed with precision. He retreated to the car outside the school, gripping the steering wheel, eyes darting nervously. Even the smallest interactions, a nod from a neighbor, a whisper between colleagues, a principal's measured acknowledgement, reminded him of the full weight of his father's quiet authority. This was not punishment in the moment. It was a slow, undeniable assertion of moral and lawful power. Daniel realized, perhaps for the first time, that I had never been absent due to weakness. My restraint, my patience, my silence, they were all tools honed over a lifetime. The humiliation he had inflicted on me Friday morning now felt hollow, almost absurd, in the light of what had been orchestrated behind the scenes. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head, the morning light cutting through the windshield and casting long, clear shadows across the dashboard. He understood now. He was not in control. The meticulous structure of my decisions had made it impossible for him to argue, manipulate, or appeal. Every step he had taken to assert dominance or embarrassment had merely paved the way for the revelation of his own limitations. As he sat there, staring at the empty playground beyond the school fence, the weight of realization pressed down. The man he thought he could shame, the father he had publicly humiliated, had been quietly orchestrating the reversal of his authority all along. Daniel had been blind to experience, wisdom, and restraint, qualities that had shaped a life far more substantial than his fleeting arrogance. The rain had started in the late afternoon, a steady, insistent drizzle that turned the streets of Willow Creek into a blur of gray reflections. I had returned home from the bank and school visits, the quiet satisfaction of completed tasks still pressing gently against my chest. My office window caught the falling light, droplets running slowly down the glass when the phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice was tense, almost pleading. "Dad, can we talk? I didn't mean for Friday to get so out of hand. I didn't interrupt. I had learned long ago that listening was more powerful than speaking. I could hear the calculated undertones beneath his apology, the manipulation veiled as remorse, a health scare, a suggestion of financial strain, a hint of regret for embarrassing me publicly, all carefully crafted to regain sympathy and control. He arrived an hour later, soaking from the rain, shoes leaving faint damp prints on the polished hardwood. His eyes darted around, looking for signs of support, for evidence that he still held sway. I gestured to a chair, my voice calm. "Sit, Daniel." He sank into it, shifting nervously. I just wanted to explain myself. Maybe we can fix things." His words were hurried, desperate. I noticed the tremor in his hands, the avoidance of my gaze. I remained still, watching. The silence stretched, giving him a false impression of control. Then, slowly, I began recounting facts, not accusations, not anger, just a careful record of events. Friday morning, at the classroom, your words were noted. Every account, every privilege you assumed was yours has been reassigned according to the estate plan. Invitations and memberships have been revoked. Community and social recognition adjusted. All legal, all deliberate. His eyes widened, the pretense of bravado cracking. "But you can't." I interrupted gently, almost conversationally. "It is not a question of can or cannot. The decisions were already in motion, Daniel. What you attempted to manipulate is now guided by law, procedure, and fairness. Your choice to humiliate me merely accelerated your own reckoning." He leaned back, face pale, eyes avoiding the mirror across the room where he might have seen himself clearly for the first time. I reached into a drawer and placed a small envelope in front of him. Inside were copies of notarized documents, financial adjustments, membership revocations, and a letter explaining the moral reasoning behind each action. No accusations, no gloating, just undeniable proof of order and consequence. Daniel's hands trembled as he touched the envelope, flipping through the contents. The manipulation he had planned, the sympathy he had sought, evaporated under the weight of fact. His final attempt to assert emotional control had been neutralized by law, preparation, and patience. He slumped back into the chair, quiet now, the storm outside echoing the turmoil within him. I watched him, silent, observing progression from desperation to recognition. The teaching moment had arrived, and it required no raised voice, no theatrics, only the calm authority of a lifetime of measured decisions. Outside, the rain continued, light spilling through the drops like streaks of reflection. Daniel's gaze finally lifted, meeting mine briefly, and there was a flicker of understanding. No words were exchanged. His collapse, internal and quiet, was complete. I stood and walked to the window, pressing my hand lightly against the glass. The rhythm of the rain mirrored the pace of justice I had always followed. Slow, deliberate, and inevitable. "What comes next," I said softly, "will be shaped by the choices you make now, not by anger, not by desperation, but by truth and integrity." Daniel didn't respond. He simply watched, the envelope on his lap, the storm outside, and the realization settling in. His father had never been weak, never been absent. All along, the restraint, the silence, the patience, they had been far more powerful than any public humiliation he could muster. Calm, lawful, and deliberate, justice had arrived not with noise, but with precision. And Daniel, for the first time, understood the full measure of his father's authority. It was a Thursday morning at Jefferson Elementary, and the air carried the faint scent of chalk dust and damp autumn leaves drifting in through the open windows. Parents milled about in the gym-turned auditorium, buzzing quietly with small talk about upcoming events and class projects. I had arrived early, not out of necessity, but out of habit, observing the routine with a calm eye. Daniel was already present, standing near the front of the room, his posture tense, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. The envelope of documents from our meeting the previous night remained in his car, a silent reminder of the irreversible changes he had failed to process. He did not notice the subtle attention of the teachers, the principal, or even a few parents who remembered my quiet presence in town over the years. As the children filed in for their presentations, the principal, Mrs. Langford, moved toward me with an expression that betrayed recognition. A brief flicker of awe behind her professional composure. "Mr. Thompson," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough for me to hear. She paused, catching the attention of the nearby teachers. I remember you, Judge Thompson, of the county court." A hush fell across the room, the kind that silenced even the whispers of restless children. Daniel stiffened visibly, eyes widening, hands clenching. The moment was subtle, yet irreversible. The silent acknowledgement of a hidden life, of a history he had assumed irrelevant. The teachers exchanged cautious glances, nodding slightly, as if confirming that the man standing before them was not merely a guest, but someone whose authority and influence had always existed quietly beneath the surface. Daniel's face paled. His rehearsed arrogance faltered as murmurs spread among parents. "Judge Thompson? I didn't realize he was the judge." That explains a lot. Some parents leaned toward one another, whispering, connecting dots that Daniel had never considered. His attempt at humiliation, the public declaration that I was not family, now seemed absurd, almost foolish. I remained still, hands folded loosely in front of me. My eyes scanned the room, taking in the subtle gestures of recognition, the measured respect, the quiet realization that truth had surfaced without theatrics or confrontation. Daniel opened his mouth, likely to assert some defense, but no words came. Silence carried weight far greater than any explanation he could muster. I spoke only once, my voice calm, precise, and reflective. Respect is not given because of proximity or title. It is earned quietly over a lifetime, and it cannot be manufactured through arrogance or cruelty. The words hung in the room, definitive yet devoid of malice. A few parents nodded. Some children shifted uneasily, and the teachers seemed to straighten, suddenly aware that a quiet lesson far deeper than any classroom curriculum had just unfolded. Daniel's shoulders slumped, the tension in his frame finally unspooling. The realization of his father's true authority, coupled with the irrevocable removal of privileges, sank fully into his consciousness. Even the environment seemed to respond. A shaft of sunlight broke through the high windows, casting diagonal beams across the polished wooden floor, illuminating the space around me as though emphasizing the shift in perception. The murmurs of recognition became respectful silence, punctuated by the soft shuffle of papers and the faint scratch of teachers' pen as they recorded attendance. Henry, sitting near the front, glanced at me with wide eyes. I offered a subtle nod, a signal of reassurance. His small hands gripped his project model, and a quiet understanding passed between us. Though Daniel's world had momentarily shaken, the lesson here was far larger, about integrity, patience, and the weight of moral authority. Daniel finally approached me, hesitation in every step. He stopped a few feet away, gaze lowered. I didn't know, he muttered, almost inaudibly. I didn't understand what you've done. I did not respond verbally. Instead, I let the documents, the previous night's meeting, and the undeniable truth of my identity speak. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to process the reality that the humiliation he had inflicted was now rendered meaningless, replaced by recognition of a life lived with quiet authority, moral clarity, and lawful precision. The principal, Mrs. Langford, placed a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder, a signal of both acknowledgement and support for the order now restored. Parents exchanged polite, measured glances, understanding that the man before them had been underestimated for decades, and that his restraint had always been a sign of deliberate strength rather than absence. Daniel looked around the room, seeing teachers, parents, and even a few of his peers' family members regarding him differently. The social landscape had shifted completely, and he understood, perhaps for the first time, that respect cannot be demanded through anger or pretense. It must be earned and observed silently over time. I finally stepped toward the doorway, letting the sunlight catch the edges of my coat. The murmurs softened into quiet conversation. The children resumed their projects, and life in the gym auditorium began to flow normally once more. The lesson had been delivered, not by confrontation, not by anger, but through calm authority, observation, and the slow, inevitable revelation of truth. As I passed Daniel, I offered a brief nod, a simple acknowledgement of both his recognition and his understanding. The subtle weight of justice, carried over decades of careful living, had fully arrived. The next morning dawned over Willow Creek with a pale, steady light. Fog rolled gently across the quiet streets, settling over the rooftops like a soft reminder that the world moves slowly, and that truth often arrives quietly, with deliberate inevitability. I sat at my desk, surrounded by neatly stacked files, notarized documents, and letters of explanation, the weight of the previous week settling like an old, familiar coat across my shoulders. Coffee steamed beside me, the warm aroma mingling with the faint scent of ink and polished wood. I began the day with a calm assessment of the remaining administrative duties. It was procedural now, but the impact was profound. Daniel's privileges, which had once seemed untouchable, were now redirected to a framework I had established, guided not by vengeance, but by precision and law. The first call was to the bank. I instructed the manager to finalize transfers and to ensure all access privileges for Daniel were permanently removed. Each step was meticulous. Signatures double-checked, accounts verified, and letters of confirmation dispatched to all relevant parties. The process was methodical, deliberate, and above all, lawful. The manager, used to my calm authority, nodded without comment, understanding the unassailable certainty of these actions. Next came the social dimension. I contacted the country club and other local organizations, confirming that membership revocations were effective and irreversible. Invitations to committees, boards, and community events were adjusted accordingly. All communications were courteous and factual, leaving no room for dispute, and ensuring that my son could no longer manipulate perception or influence through proximity or assumed entitlement. At Henry School, I submitted letters to the principal and staff, clarifying my position and the rationale for all decisions taken regarding Daniel. The letters were formal, precise, and devoid of emotion. They served as a permanent record, ensuring that every interaction, every policy adjustment, and every response would be grounded in reason and fact, leaving no ambiguity for Daniel to exploit. By mid-morning, the town began to absorb the reality of the shift. Rumors of Daniel's abrupt loss of privileges and the formal acknowledgement of my authority spread slowly through neighbors, friends, and colleagues. Conversations in the diner, at the post office, and along the main street shifted from casual gossip to measured acknowledgement of events now firmly documented. People nodded in quiet recognition when our paths crossed. Their tone was respectful, their awareness of my history and discretion now fully realized. Even Daniel's closest allies began to distance themselves. Phone calls went unanswered, invitations stopped, and casual nod became polite, but distant gestures. The social network he had relied upon, once confident and supportive, dissolved quietly under the weight of indisputable facts. I observed all of it from a distance, without intervention, letting the procedural mechanisms carry the full weight of consequence. Throughout the day, I reflected on the moral dimension of what had unfolded. This was not about triumph or humiliation. It was about alignment. Lawful, deliberate steps had restored balance to relationships, privileges, and social structures that had been abused by arrogance. The community, once silent or misled, now understood the quiet authority I had maintained for decades, and Daniel's misjudgment of my character became a lesson for others, not through spectacle, but through undeniable evidence. I paused at my window, watching fog lift from the streets and the sunlight slowly filtering through the trees. The world seemed steadier, quieter, the morning rhythm unbroken, yet shifted subtly by the assertion of lawful control. It was a reminder that true authority is exercised through consistency, precision, and moral clarity, not through public confrontation or emotional display. The final task of the morning was symbolic as much as procedural. I placed the remaining envelopes of legal documentation into the hands of my attorney, who would ensure proper filing and public record. Each paper represented accountability, integrity, and the quiet affirmation that consequences, when administered with law and foresight, endure longer than any moment of anger or resentment. By late afternoon, the town had adapted. Conversations in shops and cafes included mentions of my identity, the careful orchestration of privileges, and the recognition that fairness had been restored. Teachers and parents approached me with nods and greetings, small but meaningful gestures of respect. Daniel, for his part, remained quiet, absorbed in the full weight of what had been lost. The lesson had settled, and it required no repetition. I poured a second cup of coffee, letting the warmth seep into my hands. The sun had climbed higher, illuminating the neat stacks of files on my desk, each a testament to restraint, preparation, and the deliberate use of quiet authority. I reflected that power, once recognized, need not be brandished. It merely needs to exist, consistent and undeniable, for justice to follow naturally. Outside, the town moved as it always had, unaware of the meticulous orchestration behind the scenes. Yet life in Willow Creek had shifted subtly. Respect now accompanied recognition, humility tempered pride, and the consequences of arrogance had been administered without spectacle or malice. Justice had arrived, not with noise or vengeance, but with calm precision. As the day drew to a close, I stood on the porch, watching the flag above the courthouse stir gently in the evening breeze. The sun cast long shadows across the quiet street, painting the town in soft golds and grays. The ledger was clean, the actions complete, and the moral balance restored. The small town of Willow Creek is a place where news travels quietly but thoroughly, like ripples across a still pond. By midweek, murmurs of Daniel's loss of privileges had reached the diner, the post office, and even the Sunday school hall. Yet, whispers had a way of shifting, bending, and reshaping the story. Daniel, desperate to reclaim any fragment of control or sympathy, had begun weaving his counter-narrative. The first signs appeared online. A local community forum carried a post from someone claiming to have overheard Daniel's side, that he had been wronged unfairly, that I had overreacted, that he was just trying to keep family together. The language was subtle, manipulative, carefully designed to invoke pity and redirect blame. I read the post silently from my desk, the morning light filtering through the blinds, casting lines across my paperwork. My hands rested on the edges of the documents that had already redirected every privilege and recorded every legal and moral action. There was no rush to respond. The law, truth, and deliberate procedure spoke louder than rumor. That evening, a knock came at the front door. Rain had begun again, light and persistent. Daniel stood there, shoulders hunched, expression oscillating between shame, fear, and desperate hope. "Dad, I need to talk. People are saying things. I don't know how to explain it." I gestured calmly toward the living room chair. "Sit, Daniel." He sank into it, wet shoes leaving faint puddles. I'm just trying to set the record straight," he began, voice strained. "People think I've been treated unfairly. They don't know." I let him speak, listening without interruption. His words carried all the usual manipulations: health concerns, financial strain, and half-hearted admissions of guilt intended to provoke sympathy. But beneath the surface, the desperation was plain. He sought to rewrite history through pity, gossip, and emotional distortion. When he paused, expecting a reaction, I slid the envelope across the coffee table. Inside were copies of the notarized documents, financial account closures, membership revocations, letters to the principal and community organizations, and estate plan revisions that remove his privileges. Each page was precise, factual, and legally binding. "Daniel," I said quietly, "this is the reality. These actions are lawful, deliberate, and permanent. The story you try to tell others cannot alter what has been recorded and verified. Your narrative is no longer relevant to the truth." He glanced down at the envelope, fumbling with its corners, realization dawning slowly. "But they'll believe me. People always believe the loudest voice." I shook my head gently. "Not when facts exist in permanence. Not when truth has been documented and witnessed. You may speak, but your story carries no weight against what is recorded, lawful, and undeniable. False narratives fade, Daniel. Reality endures." For several minutes, he sat in silence, the rain outside tapping gently against the windows. His previous attempts at dominance, at manipulation, had unraveled quietly, without spectacle, leaving him exposed to the consequences he had set in motion. The subtle humiliation, the social isolation, the legal redirection, all were now undeniable. "You wanted control through sympathy," I continued, calm and deliberate, "but power exercised through manipulation is fragile. What you see here is a result of restraint, patience, and lawfulness. You cannot unwrite what has been rightly established." He looked up briefly, eyes glossy, then back at the envelope. The weight of understanding pressed down. The final attempt at control had failed. Every document, every step, every lawful action I had taken removed his ability to rewrite reality. His manipulation evaporated, leaving him facing the consequences of his own behavior. Outside, the rain eased, sunlight breaking through clouds in scattered shafts across the porch. The soft illumination seemed symbolic, a quiet reflection of clarity replacing confusion. Daniel's posture shifted subtly, a tacit acknowledgement of defeat and the realization that truth, once documented, cannot be undone. I rose, moving toward the window to observe the town's calm evening streets. "The lesson," I said quietly, "is not about victory over another. It is about integrity, patience, and the inevitability of truth. Stories may be told, but law and fact endure. You may attempt to bend perception, but you cannot alter the foundation of reality." Daniel remained seated, subdued, finally grasping that the power he had sought through gossip, pity, or moral inversion was meaningless against a life built on quiet authority, deliberate preparation, and lawful execution. The evening stretched on. The community's response remained measured. Some acknowledged my actions privately, some remained silent, and all observed the calm structure I had established. No one needed to see confrontation to understand consequence. The story Daniel attempted to spread lost momentum, unable to compete with evidence, precedent, and moral clarity. Finally, as he rose to leave, I offered only one measured statement. "False stories die on their own, Daniel. Truth requires no defense." He nodded, the first glimmer of comprehension in his eyes. Outside, the soft wind carried away the last drops of rain, scattering them across the streets and lawns of Willow Creek. The town, the family, and even Daniel's perception had been realigned, not through anger or spectacle, but through patience, law, and deliberate moral authority. The morning was calm, almost deceptively so. Willow Creek awoke under a thin veil of mist, and the familiar sounds of mail trucks and distant church bells carried across the streets. I sat on my porch, sipping coffee, watching as the town moved through its routines. But beneath the quiet, the ripples of consequence were spreading through Daniel's world. News arrived secondhand at first. Neighbors mentioning that Daniel's company account had been frozen, that the local social club had officially removed his membership, and that invitations to upcoming community events had been quietly rescinded. The administrative and legal steps I had implemented were unfolding with precision, and the results were unmistakable. Daniel attempted to counter, of course. He called old contacts, sent hurried emails, tried to appeal to friends for support. But every action met with polite refusal or procedural denial. Banks confirmed the closures. Community leaders adhered strictly to the revised social orders. Teachers and school officials responded only with formal, factual statements. No one challenged the documented reality I had put in place. By midday, the first social cracks began to appear. Daniel's friends started avoiding him, uncertain whether their associations might carry unforeseen consequences. Invitations he once counted on vanished quietly, without confrontation, leaving him isolated in spaces where he had once been dominant. Even casual conversations in the diner shifted. Neighbors nodded politely but avoided prolonged engagement. His network, previously confident and supportive, dissipated under the weight of documented truth and communal discretion. The collapse extended to his professional life. An accountant, previously aligned with Daniel, contacted me indirectly to confirm the legitimacy of the account closures. Suppliers and colleagues, alerted to the legal realities, adjusted their dealings, leaving Daniel facing an unmistakable void of influence. Every avenue he had assumed to manipulate or control had been preemptively addressed. Through it all, I observed quietly. No gloating, no confrontation. Just a calm, measured awareness of a man who knew that consequence unfolds more powerfully when allowed to move naturally through procedural channels. I maintained routines, sifting papers, reviewing files, responding to correspondence. But each action was deliberate, ensuring that Daniel's world eroded through law, procedure, and community awareness rather than spectacle or anger. There were emotional consequences, too. I heard, through neighbors and friends, murmurs of Daniel's growing desperation. His voice in private conversations carried strain, frustration, and uncharacteristic hesitation. Small errors crept into his speech and demeanor, the subtle tremor of a man whose authority had been quietly but decisively undermined. Yet even amidst the collapse, I held a compassionate awareness. Daniel had been my son. Once, I had loved him deeply, guided him patiently. That history was neither erased nor forgotten, but it did not shield him from the natural consequences of his choices. Observing his reckoning, I recognized a balance of justice, measured, lawful, and morally sound, not fueled by bitterness or vengeance. By late afternoon, visible signs of his decline became undeniable. Notices of unpaid bills, social disengagement, and professional setbacks reached him sequentially, each item reinforcing procedural authority I had established. He attempted interventions, late-night calls, unsent emails, and whispered explanations to mutual acquaintances, but these were systematically neutralized by records, witnesses, and legal documentation. Every manipulation failed, leaving him exposed to the full impact of his prior arrogance. I moved through the town as usual, collecting mail, stopping briefly at the post office, tending to Henry's school needs, allowing the world to unfold around me. Each interaction reinforced the calm authority I maintained, contrasted starkly against the erosion of Daniel's influence. The lesson had been delivered without spectacle. Consequence moved silently but inexorably, like water eroding stone over time. As evening approached, I returned to the porch. The fading light cast long shadows across the street, mirroring the residual influence and fading pride of my son. I watched him from a distance, walking home with shoulders slumped, expression tense, weighed down by social and procedural isolation. It was a quiet reckoning, unforced, undeniable, and wholly of his own making. The final symbolic act of closure came with the filing of one last notarized document, a comprehensive record of all legal, social, and financial adjustments. I placed it in the town's public record, ensuring permanence. With it, every avenue of manipulation, distortion, or misrepresentation was closed. Truth, law, and integrity now presided unequivocally. Before nightfall, I reflected on the outcome. Grace had been maintained throughout. Compassion without tolerance for abuse, patience without indulgence of arrogance, silence without weakness. The collapse had unfolded naturally, procedurally, and with moral precision. Daniel's world, once vibrant with assumed entitlement, now stood corrected, exposing the inevitability of lawful and ethical authority. The final image that lingered in my mind was simple, a signed document resting on the porch table, its ink still drying, sunlight fading behind the distant hills. It symbolized not triumph, but the quiet restoration of balance. The world had adjusted. Justice, measured and deliberate, had been observed. What came next would rewrite everything Daniel believed about consequence, integrity, and the enduring weight of lawful moral authority. The park bench near Willow Creek's small river had become my refuge that afternoon. Sunlight dappled through the maples, casting uneven patterns on the gravel path. The town moved lazily around us. Children on bicycles, neighbors walking dogs, the soft hum of distant traffic. It was calm, unhurried, the perfect setting for clarity. Daniel arrived reluctantly, his gait hesitant, hands shoved into his coat pockets. The tension was visible in every line of his posture. He was a man weighed down by the consequences he had never anticipated. He paused when he saw me, taking a moment to steady his voice before speaking. "Dad, I need to say something," he began, voice strained. "I know what I did, and I see now what it cost me and you. I was wrong." I listened, letting him speak without interruption. His words carried genuine regret this time, stripped of deflection or manipulation. The long sequence of procedural, social, and legal consequences had done their work, humbling him, forcing acknowledgement of reality, and now creating a space for moral reflection. He continued, eyes avoiding mine, gaze fixed on the gravel at his feet. I thought I could control it all, manipulate perception, rewrite the story. I see now, I can't. Not against truth. Not against you. I nodded slowly, a calm, measured acknowledgement. "Daniel," I said quietly, "the past cannot be rewritten. Privilege and entitlement have limits. Integrity and lawfulness endure." He looked up, eyes searching mine, seeking some trace of anger or reprisal. He found none. Instead, he saw a father who had maintained patience, observation, and moral clarity throughout the storm of his arrogance. "Is there any way to make amends?" he asked, voice tentative, almost a whisper. I gestured toward the envelope I had brought with me, containing the final set of documents, signed, notarized, and filed. They detailed the reallocation of privileges, the confirmation of community and social adjustments, and protective orders already in effect. Amends, I said, are only possible through honesty, acknowledgement, and acceptance of responsibility. These documents are part of that acknowledgement. Beyond them, your actions must speak. Daniel absorbed the gesture, understanding that restitution was procedural as much as emotional. Words alone could not erase the impact of past arrogance or manipulation. True redemption required deliberate effort, accountability, and respect for boundaries already established. We sat together in silence for a few minutes, the gentle sounds of the river and rustling leaves providing a calm backdrop. There was no need for dramatics. The moral weight of the situation had been carried through law, procedure, and quiet authority. Now existed in the space between us, unspoken but undeniable. Finally, he spoke again, softer this time. "I understand. I will respect what's been said. I see now that trying to rewrite the past only made things worse. I'm sorry for everything, Dad." I offered a simple nod. Recognition of truth, Daniel, is the first step toward restoring any measure of trust. The rest is carried out quietly, through consistent, honorable action. You cannot reclaim what was lost through anger or charm. You rebuild through integrity and patience. He exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. For the first time in weeks, I saw his posture relax, not fully, but enough to signify understanding. The collapse of his attempt at manipulation had led him here, to quiet reflection, without the need for confrontation or humiliation. I handed him one final item from the envelope, a letter outlining clear boundaries and expectations moving forward, emphasizing responsibility, honesty, and moral accountability. "This," I said, "is your framework. Follow it, and your future interactions may carry some measure of restored dignity. Ignore it, and consequence will continue without leniency." He accepted the letter carefully, nodding, a subtle acknowledgement of both the authority it represented and the responsibility it demanded. The symbolic act of passing the document, precise, deliberate, and unemotional, was a final gesture of closure, bridging accountability with the potential for redemption. We stood together, the sun shifting toward late afternoon, casting warm, golden light across the river and the gravel path. The air was calm, the town around us unaware of the quiet moral realignment taking place. Daniel remained subdued, yet attentive, recognizing that his choices had led him to this reckoning, and that the opportunity for restored dignity was contingent entirely upon his actions going forward. I spoke one last time, voice soft but firm. Truth cannot be undone, Daniel. Privilege cannot be demanded. Respect cannot be taken. You have seen the consequences of assuming otherwise. Learn from them. He nodded again, this time with sincerity. The weight of realization had settled fully into his posture, and the quiet authority I had maintained for decades stood undeniable between us. The moral structure had been restored, not through rage, spectacle, or humiliation, but through patience, lawful action, and unwavering integrity. As he walked away toward the bridge leading back to town, I watched him move with a new awareness, a tentative respect for the structures he had previously ignored. The choices before him were clear, the path forward narrow but attainable, grounded in honesty and accountability. I remained on the bench a moment longer, listening to the river and observing the town's slow rhythm. The lessons had been delivered. The collapse, the procedural adjustments, and the final confrontation had all contributed to this reckoning. My role was complete, not as a judge of vengeance, but as a witness to integrity, patience, and moral authority exercised without spectacle. Weeks had passed since the courthouse steps confirmed the permanence of my decisions. Willow Creek had settled into a rhythm that reflected truth, integrity, and quiet justice. Autumn had begun to edge into the town, painting maples and oaks in shades of amber and rust. The air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves, a crispness that reminded me of the inevitability of change and the slow passing of consequence. Mornings returned to their simple routines. I tended my small garden, turning soil and planting bulbs with coming spring, each motion a reminder of care, patience, and nurturing. The porch swing creaked gently in the early light as I sipped my coffee, the warm cup grounded me in reflection and peace. Life had resumed its natural rhythm, and the weight of past betrayal had been replaced by calm authority. Neighbors began to greet me more openly, a quiet respect visible in their nods and smiles. Old friends returned to the diner for morning coffee, exchanging polite conversation and gentle acknowledgement of the restored order in our town. Children waved from the schoolyard, and parents, once uncertain, now approached with calm recognition rather than curiosity. The subtle gesture spoke volumes. The community had observed, reflected, and adjusted to the quiet moral authority I had maintained. Daniel remained in my awareness, but at a safe distance. He had accepted the consequences of his actions, navigating the boundaries laid before him. I had no desire for revenge, no wish to see him falter beyond what was right. The lesson had been taught, integrity maintained, and trust measured. Redemption was to earn. Grace was my gift, freely offered, but tempered by observation and careful boundaries. The revoked inheritance, now realigned, was redirected to causes that reflected my values and honored the larger community. A veteran fund received donations, supporting those who had served quietly and without recognition. An orphanage in a neighboring county received endowments to sustain education programs, and a scholarship was established for students demonstrating integrity and leadership, values I had always sought to cultivate, both in my family and the town. Each act was deliberate, thoughtful, and symbolic, the tangible manifestation of moral restoration, the creation of legacy beyond personal grievance. Evenings were spent on the porch, watching the river reflect the setting sun. Birds traced lazy arcs across the sky, wings catching the last light of day. I often reflected on the lessons learned, not from rage or spectacle, but through patience, procedural precision, and moral clarity. Betrayal, humiliation, and manipulation had tested me, but their resolution had been shaped not by anger, but by deliberate action, calm authority, and compassion tempered with wisdom. I wrote letters to friends, to community leaders, and even some estranged family members. They carried nothing of bitterness, only reflection, guidance, and affirmation of values, integrity, honesty, and measured action. Each note was a small act of connection, reinforcing the enduring bonds that truth and fairness strengthen rather than break. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Daniel, delivered with hesitation and care. Its contents were brief but sincere, an acknowledgement of past wrongs, gratitude for measured guidance, and a promise to respect the boundaries and frameworks established. I responded in kind. Kindness without indulgence, acknowledgement without expectation, closure without attachment. The final act of symbolic closure came naturally, with the first frost in November. I walked to the garden, brushing soil from my hands, and watched as the fading leaves drifted along the edge of the fence. The wind carried a quiet reminder that time moves steadily, that lessons endure, and that grace, once extended, can shape futures in ways measured by integrity rather than spectacle. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting amber and violet hues across the water, I breathed deeply, aware that peace had been restored, not through triumph over another, but through careful, lawful, and moral authority. The quiet of Willow Creek now reflected the order and dignity that had been patiently reclaimed. The legacy was simple but enduring, a life that taught consequence without cruelty, integrity without arrogance, and restoration without vengeance. The town, my family, and even Daniel had witnessed the truth in action, and now the lesson would echo beyond immediate memory, carried in the lives shaped by law, morality, and deliberate care. As darkness fell, the birds settled into the trees, their final calls fading into evening. I closed the journal I had been writing, its pages filled with reflection, observation, and the story of justice exercised through patience and moral clarity. If this story reminded you that silence can hold power, like and subscribe. Tell me which state you're listening from. I want to see how far these stories travel.